payment means 5 o'clock comes and you're off the payroll. So we have always done the 5:30, particularly back when the old visitor center used to be right across the street there. And we agreed at that time that they wanted to clear the building so they could go home, and they figured we need something over here to attract people out of the building. And that's when we started about 32 years ago doing these 5:30 programs. And now we add to that the 7 o'clock TAPS program. So if you're here for the TAPS program, this will end right where that will take place. So then it's up to you if you want to stick around for that. You can, you'll be right there. If you don't, you know where your car is parked. Okay? And I have 5:30, so we'll get moving. What we're going to do is take you around and tell you a little bit about this cemetery, Soldiers National Cemetery. We talk very little about the battle because the battle's over. There's between 8,000 and 10,000 bodies lying out in the fields. And the most pressing issue was to get those bodies underground in the heat of July, and most of them were buried by about the 9th of July. So you've got a battle 1, 2, and 3. By the 9th of July, you've got most of the carnage, human being-wise, buried. And that means it's done fairly quickly. The second thing that's kind of important about the talk tonight is the Gettysburg Address. And it is the most confusing place where the Gettysburg Address was given, because nobody really knew, and there is no true marking where it's at today. A lot of people walk in and look at that. That was built in the early 20th century. It is called the Lincoln Speech Memorial. I always say it's unique because it's the only monument in the world that was ever built to a speech. It's not to Abraham Lincoln, it's to the Gettysburg Address, even though his bust is on it. A lot of people come in here and stand on this and say, well, that's probably where he gave it, that's why it's here. It's called the rostrum. It was built in 1879, and when did Lincoln give the address? 63. So no, this isn't the right spot. We've had a lot of presidents speak from this. It used to be traditional that during the president's administration, at least once, they would tend to come to Gettysburg, either for the Memorial Day program or for what we call Dedication Day, the 19th of November, dedication to the cemetery and the anniversary of Lincoln's address. The last one who came was Dwight Eisenhower, which isn't hard because he only lives 2 miles down the road. Would have made it ridiculous. John Kennedy was scheduled to come here for Memorial Day of 1964, and what happens?
He was shot.
He's assassinated the previous November, and no president has come since. So I don't know whether they use it as an excuse not to come or they just don't come. But we had, I think, 8 or 9 different presidents speak from this rostrum back here. And you're going to see over where they do the TAPS program is called the Soldiers National Monument. That's another very popular spot for people to say Lincoln spoke there. And in 1970, the state of Kentucky even put a monument that said Lincoln spoke here. But guess what? It's wrong. I'm not sure exactly how they got permission to do it, but it's there and it says. So people usually, quite frankly, don't get much past where we're standing. They take a picture there with their family and out the gate they go. They saw where Lincoln spoke. So that's the second thing we'll do today, is show you a little bit about that. Now, the place we're at is called Cemetery Hill. And Cemetery Hill was already that at the time this battle was fought. That is the cemetery that gave the name to Cemetery Hill. It's called Evergreen. It is the town's burial ground. At the time of the battle, it was about 8 years old and had about 500 graves in it. But it was the only substantial thing on this hill. Everywhere else was being farmed. Largely cornfields, some wheat fields, some orchards down at the far end. This is all farmland. And the reason you see cannon in here today, because it's a battle position. If you kind of look around, you can see out in the fields there, the fields of Pickett's Charge. If it was a little bit less trees, you could see the round tops down to the south. Colts Hill over this way. All the key parts of the battlefield are visible from this hill, and this hill is the basic focus of the whole 3 days of the battle. So it seemed to be an appropriate place to also then bury the guys who died as a result of this battle. So without further ado, I think everybody's here that's going to be here. We're going to take a little stroll. Some of it will be on this pavement right here. Some of it will be in the grass when we get over to the actual grave sites. If you are tired of listening to me at any point, walk away. I won't feel obligated to yell at you or anything like that. You're not required to stay. And I do stick around at the end for a little bit of time. If you have some specific questions you want to ask, I can certainly do it for you. Okay? All right, let's head on out here a little bit, brother. Get away from this man. Now, I won't be racing through the cemetery. I'll be making frequent stops, so I'll kind of wait till everybody catches up before I say anything interesting. The person that I usually like to talk about here is a guy named David Wills. And if you've been through the town at all, down in the center of town in the traffic circle that we, because we're kind of crazy here in Adams County, call Lincoln Square, or the Diamond. David Wills was a local attorney back at that time, a member of the Republican Party, and the governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, was a prominent Republican, and they knew each other. And the governor of Pennsylvania, Curtin, came here about the 12th of July to see how the town had fared. Like any other governor today, you have a disaster takes place, you go as soon as you can to help out what you can help. And he was going around from place to place, point to point, checking on the wounded, the conditions of wounded. And what shocked him were the dead. They had been buried relatively shallow. These are not nice 6-foot, 8-foot graves with coffins and a minister or a priest speaking over them. These are just simply scooped out holes in the ground, body rolled in, blanket thrown over, and a couple shovelfuls of dirt. And there was one place in particular where they said the governor's carriage had to go completely off the roadbed because they had buried soldiers right in the middle of the road. And he felt at the very least that was owed these people was a proper burial. So he went downtown and got a hold of his friend David Wills, the young attorney, and he basically essentially said, I want you to be my agent here in town. I want you to find a place to bury soldiers, and I want you to find people who can do it. I will go do the most important thing. I will go back to Harrisburg and I will find the money to do it. This cemetery, folks, is called Soldiers National Cemetery. It is a national cemetery today. It was originally created as a product of the 18 northern states. Not the federal government, not the U.S. Army, the 18 northern states. And that is why you won't find who buried in here. Southerners. Okay? The southern governors aren't talking to the northern governors. They aren't part of this project. This was exclusively a burial place for the Union battle dead. And Governor Curtin, true to his word, did go back and did manage to convince all of the other governors, 17 more of them, that this was a worthy project, and all of them contributed money to the purchase of the land and the burial of the dead and the landscaping of the cemetery. Now, you got to understand that we are in Pennsylvania, and we are relatively close to a couple very major population areas, and there was a rail line that came into town, which meant that people of the north could get to this battlefield. And family members, wives, children, mothers, fathers started to descend upon this area about mid-July if they had not heard from their loved one or they found out he was dead, and they were going out trying to find the bodies to remove them from their battlefield graves. There's a story that's told of a woman who went out looking for her husband and digging up graves, but not being particularly careful. She didn't see him in that grave. She didn't bother covering it back over again. And finally the Army stepped in and stopped it all and said, no, we can't have this. We can't constantly be worried about bodies on the ground decomposing and perhaps causing some kind of disease. And they sort of put the area under almost a form of martial law, meaning that you could not go out on the battlefield and gather artifacts. You could not go out on the battlefield and exhume graves. Nothing, because the Army would not allow it. And that gives David Wills time to plan. And the first thing he has to do is buy land. And he bought this piece of land that we're standing on right now. That fence wasn't there at the time, but that was the boundary of the old Evergreen Cemetery. And he actually bought a little bit of land off of them. And then that stone wall was built after the cemetery was created. That's called the Tawny Town Road there. So you kind of had this real skinny piece of land, and he continued buying little bits and pieces until he got about 20 acres, or maybe a little bit more than that. And if you're a golfer, you would call it a dog leg, because it goes down there and makes a right turn and goes back off that way. It's not an easy cemetery to lay out. So Wills hired a landscape architect, a guy named William Saunders. And Saunders came here to Gettysburg and looked at this raw piece of land, and it was his plan to put in these roadways that you're on now. They're carriageways in the 1860s, roadways today, roadways which we don't use. If any of you came in that gate, there's a sign there that says what? No vehicles. So you have a nice road, the only people who own it are park people, or if we have some kind of funeral going on in here, to use it. It was William Saunders who laid out all of this tree growth that you see here. Originally, this is farm fields. He planned it as an area that it would eventually grow up and seal off the outside world, and you could come here on a Sunday afternoon with your family and bring a picnic lunch and lay it out and go over and strew flowers on the graves. That's the original intent of the cemetery. And indeed, you have a lot of open areas like this that we don't have graves in, and we'll never put graves in there, because in the original plan, this was always to be an open, grassy area. And the one thing you're not allowed to do in any national cemetery today is eat. Picnic. Okay, don't come in here tomorrow and try to spread out your blanket. That's an 1863 thing. Today, national cemeteries do not allow you to picnic or eat in a national cemetery, nor bring pets in, nor bring anything like that into it. So all of this is taking place in August, September, October, and where are those dead soldiers still? Where they originally fell. Sometimes miles from here. And every day, wounded are dying in hospitals, and they're being buried in the farm fields or at the barn where they died. So there are more and more graves going in all the time. So let's take a walk down to the grave sites now. All right, we are just at the edge of the Civil War burials right now. And it was William Saunders, that architect, who proposed a semicircle. You go to Arlington, go to other cemeteries, and see everybody's impressed by the nice long rows that look the same in every direction. But the problem in a cemetery like that is somebody's going to get the skunky grave way back in the back corner somewhere, while somebody else gets the prime graves right in front. Saunders said a semicircle or a circle, there are no good graves or bad graves. Everybody is relatively equal to the center. And that is what he recommended, and that is what David Wills adopted, a huge semicircular burial plot. Now, Wills needed people to do this, so it is a contract job, government, meaning it's going to be to the low bidder. And the low bid was $1.59 per body. And with that fee, starting on the 27th of October, when the Army allowed exhumations, the contractors would go out. They had to go open up physically every single grave they found on the battlefield, because there's no way to 100% guarantee who's in that hole until you go and look at it. If they were Confederate soldiers, they would be required to bury that soldier deep enough he will not wash out, and to mark the grave as permanently as they can if there was already a marking on it. 9 years later, a group of ladies from Richmond, Virginia, the Hollywood Memorial Association, came back here and hired basically the same burial crews to go back out one more time and dig up the Confederate dead. And the vast majority of those 3,300 roughly are buried in a place called Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia today, the old Confederate capital. Most of them are in marked or unknown graves, just a stone to say the Confederate dead, or the Gettysburg dead. If they were Union soldiers, you had to physically identify them the best you could. Now, these guys have been in the ground 4, 5, 6 months sometimes. They do not wear dog tags. Those do not come around officially until the Spanish-American War 30 years later. Some of these guys had kind of, when I was very young, some of you probably too young for that, You used to go to carnivals and they had these stamping machines. You could stamp out a little tag with your name or something on it. They had that technology back then, so soldiers could go to sutlers and buy one of those. So maybe they had something like that around their neck. The problem was it was such a novel idea that if you saw a dead guy lying there and he had that nice metal around his neck, you had no qualms about taking it out and putting it around your neck, which means if you shot 10 minutes later, you're getting his name. So wedding rings, watches, Bibles, diaries, letters, anything they could find in the guy's pocket, they would use for identification. They placed them in a wooden box, put them on a wagon, brought him back here to the cemetery, and he would be then buried and his grave marked. The original markings would have been basically boards nailed to the end of the coffin and sticking out of the ground. So Abraham Lincoln never saw this. What he saw was a lot of dirt, a lot of mounds of graves, and boards sticking up out of the ground when he actually looked at it when he was here. The wrinkle in this is Saunders' original idea was this is going to be the first grave. We're just going to start burying a soldier there, and we're just going to keep going and filling up the outring and move inside and just keep going. And the governor of Massachusetts, a guy named John Andrews, stopped it. He said, wait. He said, I don't want my Massachusetts dead buried with everybody else. They're Massachusetts guys. They're a step above you other 17 states, and I certainly don't want it. And if you don't put them alone, I'm going to take them all back to Massachusetts. And because Wills and Curtin felt very strongly, thank you, this should show a national effort, that they bent over backwards, and Saunders suggested something. He said, why don't we take our semicircle, we'll just divide it into segments, and we'll give every state its own segment. Now, that works, but now creates a problem, because that means you have to do what with everybody? As to state. You've got to know what state they came from. And if you don't, what are we going to do with it? Well, what they did is they took this end of the cemetery, and they took the other end of the cemetery, and they created graves with just numbers on the stone. 979 bodies could not be identified by anything other than they were a Union soldier. So we don't need a tomb of the unknown soldier on any Civil War battlefield. We have more than 2,000 of them buried right here. These guys are unknown, total unknown. So that project started on 27th October, and it goes the whole way through March of 1864. It took them all winter, and they worked every single day that winter, bringing bodies back, and eventually brought 3,512 bodies back to the cemetery. So I want to take you through now and show you a little bit about it. I'm going to tell you that they're very kind of uniquely body number 926. This is his tombstone. I am not standing on him. Saunders said to bury them with their heads here at the stone and their feet out, so they all face the battlefields they died defending. So if you don't like to walk on people's graves, you stay on this side of the stone and you're safe. The tallest soldier in the Battle of Gettysburg I know of, David Van Buskirk, 6'11" and a half inches tall. He did not die in the battle, but if you stay 7 feet away, you're guaranteed you haven't stepped on anything. So follow me to this section. These were gravel walkways that radiated out from the central monument. They no longer are, for reasons I'll mention in a minute. But once we crossed over that walkway right there, you entered Indiana's plot. The names are not on the stone, but there is a tombstone right at the base of each plot that tells you what state you're looking at and how many dead are buried in it. And you'll notice we have a whole slew of unknown right here. What gives them one piece of identification they don't have is they were all buried in a trench with members of the 20th Indiana, or they had numeral 20 on their hats or numeral 20 on their coats. So some reason they knew they were 20th Indiana, they knew they were from Hoosiers, they buried in here with their friends. So if you look at that, unknown, approximately 1/2 of the people in this cemetery are unknown. If you look at the positive side, 1/2 have some kind of identification in a day long before we had good ways to identify people. And sometimes you can only find initials FHK. May have gotten it off a wedding ring or watch. Now today, with our technology and our information, we probably, in fact I'm sure we do, know who he was. The problem is these stones are 100 plus years old, and once something hits 100 years old, it's pretty much historically protected. So we cannot alter that stone in any way. There are some people saying, well, why don't we put a plaque in front of it with the full information? And so far the Park Service has not paid attention to that at all with it. Now originally, I told you these would have been gravel walkways. These stones set about a foot up off the ground originally. These are not to be flat stones. You should be looking around at these little coping stones. But in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt, president at the time, signed an executive order giving the National Park Service battlefield parks, which prior to that were all run by the U.S. Army. And about 14 of those have cemeteries associated with them. So these cemeteries do not fall under the Veterans Administration or the Army today. They are National Park Service run cemeteries. And the first thing they did in the 1930s is they brought in dirt and they filled these all in. Why? Mowing, to make it easier to mow. That's when the gravel walkways disappeared, and that's when these coping stones sunk at that time. So there is a long-term plan today to restore that look to the cemetery. It's like everything else in the government. It's who barks the loudest, who gets the money for the project. So we'll see. So that's Indiana. Come over here to Ohio. Ended up with a buckeye tree over the Ohio State plot. And back in 1863, I don't know if buckeyes were a thing in Ohio, but it is very appropriate today. But we are in the Ohio State plot here, and I wanted to point out this fellow right here. His name is George Nixon. You guys have heard that name before, right?
Yes.
This is President Richard Nixon's great-grandfather. He was 40 years old when the Civil War began. He was a farmer in Ohio. He had 9 children. And at the age of 40, the chances of you being drafted, because there is no draft yet, was slim to none. So he volunteered to join as an enlisted soldier. And here he is, 40 years old. He's running around with people who are 17, 18, 19 years old. And here in the Battle of Gettysburg, the 73rd Ohio was on what was called skirmish duty. You got to picture that wall's not there, none of those buildings are there. About a mile over across the field would be Seminary Ridge and the Confederate Army, and in between the two armies were skirmishers. These were early warning systems. So if you want to get a decent sleep at night, you put regiments out there in that field, and if the enemy's coming at you and they start firing, you hear it, you can pick up your weapons, wake up, get going. It's a nasty job because you're out there, which means if you get hit, where do you stay? Out there. And if you die alone, you die in the middle of that field. Somebody's going to bury you who doesn't know you, and you're unknown. Well, George Nixon was shot out there that day, July 2nd, I believe it was, and his tent mate, a 19-year-old musician named Richard Enderlin, swore that in all the screaming and the yelling and the moaning, crying, he swore he could hear his tent mate, George Nixon, out there. And it bothered him to the point that he wanted to go get him. And he kept agitating to do it, and eventually his commander got tired, I guess, listening to him and said, go ahead. And Enderlin stripped off everything he had, most of his clothing, took off all of his equipment. He lightened himself as best he could. He went running down that hillside to the area where you see that large kind of reddish colored girder today. That's where Steinway Avenue is. And then he started to dive into the fields of crops, crawling from body to body until he found his tent mate, Nixon, still alive. He supposedly dragged him back through that field. He couldn't stand up because there's Confederate skirmishers shooting at that. He dragged him through the field till he got back to the Steinway Avenue Road down there, which then was called the Emmitsburg Road. He picked up Nixon on his back. He came running up here under a hail of fire. And because he got here, George Nixon dies with friends who would know him, and he's buried with his identification. Richard Enderlin ends up with one of the 60-plus medals of honor given out as a result of the Battle of Gettysburg. for rescuing a comrade under fire. About 9 months later, Mrs. Nixon died, leaving all 9 children orphans. So the Civil War was very tough on the Nixon family. All of those children were scattered throughout Ohio and western Pennsylvania, each one going to different families. And President Nixon's grandfather, I think, was the 3rd youngest child in that group. So here he is, he ends up here. He was 43 years old when he died here at Gettysburg. All right, this is Matt. Nixon was a farm family. $300 a year maybe is the family income. He was 40 years old when the war begins. Sumner Paine had just turned 16. A lot of age difference there. And when his country is going to war and his friends are joining regiments and you're 16 years old, what do you want to do? Join. But what's the age of enlistment in the Civil War? 18 years old without parental permission. And mom and dad told him, absolutely not, you're not joining the army now. So he went to Harvard College at the age of 16. In 1861, 1862, he spends at Harvard, bored stiff, because every day he can look out the windows and see troops forming up and marching off to war, and that's what he wants. He keeps begging his family, I want to join, and finally, he said, they told him, you can join when you turn 18. And he turned 18 the 3rd week of May, 1863. And when is this battle?
July.
1st week of July. Now, I'm sure they got him a commission as a 2nd lieutenant, so there was money in the family. He didn't go in as a common private. And being an officer, he's going to have to acquire his own uniform and his own equipment. Probably that takes maybe another week or 10 days. And then somehow or another, he's got to get from Boston down to Washington. And once he gets to Washington, he's got to catch up with his regiment, the 20th Massachusetts. So it may well have been the 1st or 2nd week of June before he actually made it to the Army. And his military career will last a little under 4 weeks. During the 3rd day of the battle, there was an event called Pickett's Charge. You can see where the fields are out there, 13,000 or so Confederate soldiers coming at it. And if you go back to the Angle area, just south of the Angle, there's a monument that's just a big old ugly stone. It's called a conglomerate stone. Very common in New England. That one's called the Roxbury Pudding Stone because this unit came from the area of Roxbury, Massachusetts, and the stone used to sit on the playground there. And the soldiers, rather than buying a nice marker, decided, well, as boys we played on that rock, let's put the rock here to honor where we died. He was standing there that day watching 13,000 Confederate soldiers coming at him after a 2-hour cannonade. As the Confederates crossed the Gettysburg Road and bullets started flying, one of the first shots hit him in the right knee, and his knee collapsed under him. And the last thing his men ever heard him yell was, "Isn't this glorious?" And then his shell blew up upon him, killed him. So here he was, just a few weeks past his 18th birthday, he ends up here in Gettysburg. So we have older people than George Nixon here. I'm sure we have younger than some of them. Now, 2 graves back from him, 2 rows back, another Massachusetts how tall they are, what color eyes they had, what they did as a profession, if they died, what their mother got as a pension or what their wife got as a pension. All that stuff is in the National Archives. And sometimes you run into problems, and this was a problem in the research of this fellow. They couldn't find a J.L. Johnson in 11th Massachusetts. Now that's not unusual, because these guys died in July. If he was a friend of mine, what do I have to mark his grave with? Top of a box? Maybe a chunk of wood I can slice off the front of it, and maybe I've got a pencil in my pocket. Now, that's July. What do you think that's going to look like the following February? Hard to read. So, ladies said, well, maybe this regimental number's wrong. Let's look at every Massachusetts regiment, and it can find no soldier with that name in any Massachusetts regiment. And then somebody got the idea, the only difference between Massachusetts and Mississippi is 1 letter. M-A-S-S, M-I-S-S. And in Company K of the 11th Mississippi Infantry was Private John L. Johnson, 19 years old. Also a college student from New Carrollton, Mississippi. Also one of those 13,000 soldiers coming across the Pickett's Charge. He was shot down in front of the Union lines and left lying there for 24 hours before he was picked up. He was taken to a Union field hospital
and he lived until the 4th of August. He lived 1 month and 1 day, which begs the question, how did he end up here? So from this point on, it's speculation. Now, I can imagine his uniform, which he's been wearing for several months. It probably smells to high heaven. It's covered with mud, it's covered with sweat, it's now covered in his blood. You're a doctor. What are you going to do with that uniform?
Burn it.
I'm going to cut that off his body, I'm going to burn it. Now this is 19th century America. I'm not going to leave him lying naked in a hospital tent. In a Union hospital, what's the chances of what color he's going to get? A pair of blue trousers or a blue coat with something in his body. He dies. He's buried in a hospital cemetery with the correct everything on it. Problem is, when the burial crews come, they can't quite read that anymore. So what's the absolute proof? I'm going to dig down, I'm going to look at the body. What I'm going to find is a badly decomposed body wearing blue. It has to be Massachusetts. So that is how he ended up here. I'm not sure he's particularly happy with who he's buried with, but he is one of now 10 Confederate soldiers we've been able to identify who are mistakenly buried in the cemetery. Pennsylvania is over there, PA. We have Virginians and Georgians buried in PA, VA, GA. Okay, so mistakes were made. But they don't have technology we do today. And in 1872, the 18 states signed it over to the federal government, and in 1872, this becomes part of the national cemetery system. So even though this cemetery is here 9 months before the first burial ever took place in Arlington, Arlington is considered an older national cemetery simply because of this rate in the system. When the cemetery system was taken over, the U.S. Army took this cemetery over. And the Army always appointed what they called a superintendent. And the job qualification for being a superintendent is you had to have been a disabled veteran from the battle. So for about 45 to 50 years, the superintendents who were here had actually fought in the battle. And they maintained these graves. They maintained the ground crews and everything else. You'll notice every once in a while you see a stone like this one, and it's been cut out and corrected. If you knew that D. Hannah's name was Daniel, and you could prove it to them, the superintendent would have that carved out, ground out, and put the correct name in there. Now this cannot be done today because we can't change that stone. But up until that time they did, and as you go through the cemetery, you'll see a lot that look like this. There's a very unusual one right here. Now you can't see it very well, but this one has been carved out, and it now says unknown. The original inscription on this was Stephen Kelly, Company F, Regiment 91. Seemed like a nice, clean identification. Until the early 1880s, when the real, live Stephen Kelly came back to Gettysburg, doing what you're doing, and was shocked to find he'd been killed and buried here years before. He was in that regiment, but he was sick in a hospital at that time. And that's one of the stories that's given. And he lost his knapsack, or a knapsack was stolen. He never said which it was. He surmised that this guy was probably someone who found it or stole it and put in his pocket stuff that had Stephen Kelly's name on it. He's killed in the battle. They're going through the pockets. They find Stephen Kelly, Regiment 91st, and he gets buried here. And as long as Kelly lived, he never told the superintendent over there about this grave. He said, I would come back every summer and, quote, strew flowers on the grave of the guy who's substituting for me. When he died, he's now buried out in Philadelphia National Cemetery. The government realized, wait a minute, we got Stephen Kelly here, we got Stephen Kelly here, we know we buried this one right. That means this one is wrong. So they just simply carved that out and put unknown. We will never know who he is. He could be Confederate, he could be Union. Sometime in the summer of 1863, he found something along the road that had Kelly's name on it and put it in his pocket. And that's how he ended up here. Okay? A little bit of a walk here. This is Pennsylvania. This is the second largest state in terms of size and the second largest state in terms of numbers of dead in the battle. Once you cross the walkway over there, you cross into New York, which is the largest state contingent. They have over 800 bodies in there. And they chose to put their monument, that's that big one you see above the trees, that represents the state of New York crying over her dead. Many other states put them out on the battlefield. They wanted theirs in the cemetery. So once we cross the walkway, we cross from Pennsylvania into New York. Now, if you walk by these graves and you don't see a rank, that is because they are privates. If they are corporals or sergeants, they will have the rank corporal or sergeant. And when you realize that, you understand that what is missing are officers. And it is not the fact that officers didn't die in the battle, but officers back then came from a higher economic class. George Nixon over there was a farmer who might have made $300 a year if he's lucky. If you wanted to move a body back then, you could, but it was entirely on your own. There's no graves registration. The Army's not going to do it for you. You had to come physically to the battlefield. You had to find the body. Hopefully it had been embalmed. There are, it's kind of ghoulish, but there were embalmers that traveled with the Union Army, and if you felt that your number was up, you could go prepay them. So if something happened, they would make sure that they dug up your body and embalmed it and reburied it. If it's properly embalmed, you could get it shipped by the railroad. Even if it's not properly embalmed, you could get it placed in some kind of a metal packing container, packed probably in ice, put into a wooden box, and then they'll also ship it as freight. All this cost money, and it was on your heads. So most enlisted personnel had no ability to do that. Officers do, and many officers' families had them boxed up and moved home. The highest ranking soldier we have in the cemetery today is, where'd he end up here? He moved on me. There he is back there. Lieutenant Colonel Max Toman of the 59th New York. Colonel Toman was wounded here in the battle and was taken back to a hospital with his aide. And as he died, his last words were, "Bury me on the field with my men." So once his wife and family heard that, there was no thought of moving him anywhere else but here. Uniquely, because of the way they buried the dead, he's really not buried with his men. He's 59th New York. He's got a guy from the 42nd beside him and 64th over there. But it was close enough. He's buried in this cemetery with him. We have one more lieutenant colonel buried up in the Wisconsin plot today, which is where that fella in kind of the orange is standing right now. We have, I think, 4 majors, about 20 captains, and about 40 lieutenants. That's it. So if you add back in here every officer that should have died in battle, then you added in all of the Confederate soldiers. How many times bigger would this semicircle be? And all these guys died within about 72 hours of each other in one battle. That's what's kind of sobering about this cemetery. So, Lieutenant Colonel Toman.
Going down here a little bit further.
Identification they had. And when the wooden board was here, the original identification that was Unknown Sergeant, Regiment 154. Humiston fought in a regiment that fought on July 1st in the town. As the Union Army began to collapse on the 1st of July, they sent troops out into town to try to stem the retreat a little bit. And down on what's called Stratton Street, near where our fire hall is today, is where Sergeant Humiston met his end. He was shot down in the streets. And he was shot in such a way that he likely would have been fairly paralyzed. At any point, he wasn't going to be getting up on his feet. His men felt that if we tried to slow down and pick him up and carry him along with us, more of us are going to die. And they continued on back to this hill and left him there. And as the Confederates came by, they took a look at him. They realized he's not a threat to them. He's not going to live much longer. And they just kept going on by. And I'm sure eventually the streets got quiet, and he lay there and basically died alone in the street. And as he died, he pulled out of his pocket a tintype picture of his 3 children. And that's what he was holding in his hands when he died. Now, a newspaperman had read about that, heard about it, and he heard that a girl in the town had that picture. I think her father was like a tavern keeper, and she had that picture, and he went there and asked to see it. And he said, well, we know he's from New York, and we know we have this picture, and there's got to be somebody else in life in New York that knows what? Who those three people are. And he had sketches of it made. He published it in different newspapers throughout the state of New York, and Mrs. Humiston, that is essentially how she found out her husband's fate. And before the stones were put in 1866, between 63 and 66, that identification was made so that when the stone cutters came, they were able to put his correct information down there. You think of how many people might just taken that little piece of picture and thrown it off into the weeds off to the side because I'm not very temple dead today. These guys took great care of finding out who it was. Now, are y'all still with me?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm going to show you the youngest soldier we know in the battle, or excuse me, the youngest soldier we know buried in this cemetery. And I'm going to tell you about those stones down here. So follow me across the street. Thank you. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
Fine. Sorry.
They had children, they had families, and as they got older and started to think about their end in life, they began to make requests to be brought back here to Gettysburg and buried with their friends. They were not given permission to be buried in the semicircle, but they started to sell them plots like you see there on the exterior. That's why you have those different size stones. Those are plots. Most of those are probably Civil War soldiers. Then the Spanish-American War broke out. And we have no Spanish-American War battles within 1,000 miles of this place, but we do have training camps up in Harrisburg. The soldiers went to those camps and got sick of typhoid or some other disease and died, and they brought them here to this cemetery to bury them. Then the First World War broke out. That started to fill this cemetery, and then World War II completely filled it. In 1947, I think it was, the United States government gave a one-time only choice to families. If you had a loved one that had died overseas and was buried in an overseas cemetery, and you wished their remains to be brought home, you told them that time, yes, they would go to exhume the remains, ship it home, and bury it free of charge in the close national cemetery. That's why you look at some of these graves, these are World War II. We actually have 3 Pearl Harbor dead buried in this cemetery that the families chose to bring back here. That filled the cemetery. And then in the late 1940s, I think it was the United States Steel Corporation purchased another plot of land down there. If you look at it from the air, it's laid out the same way the graves up there are in a big semicircle, and we have graves in there from all wars up through Vietnam. So today, officially, we are declared a closed cemetery. We do have graves that still go in here occasionally, and that's only if the spouse or unmarried child of one of these already here dies. They have right of burial in the same grave. You see this one here, his wife's name is Miriam. She's in the same grave. Her name's on the back, his name's on the front. Okay. I'm going down here. He had run away from home, lived out in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. He'd gone down to South Carolina, either went to a Marine recruiter who didn't care, or he got a woman to lie about it, saying she was his aunt, claiming he was 18 years old. He joined. Mother does not know this happened until someone showed up on a doorstep saying, your son has died. My son's not in the Army, he's only 15 years old. So Paul Heller was one of those ones brought back. 15 years, 4 months, and a couple of days old when he died. He is the youngest known soldier in the cemetery. There could be younger Civil War soldiers up there. We just don't have the records to justify that, but we do have his. So we always bring people down here and show them Paul's grave. Pardon? Good question. I'm going to remove it.
Well, I found a few on a grave earlier.
Many years later, many years ago, when Lincoln Head pennies came out, 1909, people started placing Lincoln Head pennies on Lincoln's grave. Then people saw that and they started spreading it to all the other places around. And we have the plague today of people putting money on graves. The problem with that is if you put this metal and this stone it'll start doing a chemical reaction with the stone and it stings it. So people think they're doing an honorable thing. We just say, put a rock or something on top. Someday, somebody will come in through here with a metal detector. They'll probably find $10 million and solve the national debt overnight. Because there's all kind of coins all over the place. All right, let's go back up into the century. When people started to come to Gettysburg, not to find dead relatives, but to just see what the battlefield looked like. We didn't have hotels and motels in great numbers. Most people stayed at boarding houses. And many of these families in these boarding houses had relic collections because there were relics all over the place. And it got to be kind of a selling point. Come to my boarding house because I had nicer relics than the guy next door. And one of the things they did, which probably wasn't as up and up as it should be, if I found an elbow bone that had a bullet stuck in it, I don't bury it. I take that with me because people want to see that bone with a bullet in it. And gradually, a family in town called the Rosensteels bought all of these private collections and created a big museum. And that museum used to stand right across from the entrance to the visitor center here. And for many years, the National Park Service wanted to buy the building and get rid of it. And in 1971, they did. And then the Rosensteels completely signed over the entire collection to the people of the United States. So the building was sold to the government, and then they said, the collection's yours. Well, now you had a problem. The government wanted to tear the building down, but now we got this huge collection. So we ended up keeping that sucker until 2006, when we opened our brand new visitor center. But because the federal government has a policy, you cannot display human remains. They took all of those pieces out of the collection and stored them. And in the early 1990s, 1991, the superintendent at the time said, we're never going to display these things again. They should be buried. And this is where they chose to bury them. And they had a military funeral. The 3rd United States Infantry came out of Arlington to hold a military funeral for these remains. They estimate there were at least 19 different individuals represented there, and probably both armies. And then in March of 1996, a visitor was walking along a place called the Railroad Cut on the First Days Battlefield and saw a bone sticking out of the embankment. And most of us would look at that and think, well, that's just an old piece of tree root sticking there. But this guy was a forensic anthropologist that worked for the Park Service on vacation. And when he saw it, he knew immediately it was a human leg bone. And they did an excavation. They found almost a 75% complete skeleton of a soldier. He'd been shot through the head. Whoever buried him that long ago, they didn't bother putting him to a flat piece of ground. He just stuck him in a ravine in the side of this railroad embankment and covered him over, and that's where he lay for all those years. So after the Smithsonian Institution did their work with him, they were trying to identify him. How do you identify 150-year-old bones? The best they could say is he was probably no older than 19 years old. Looking at the musculation marks on his bones, they said he'd done a lot of hard work in his young life. He was probably a farmer, so they told us he was a 19-year-old farmer. That does not help us. 90% of them were 19-year-old farmers in both armies. So he was buried here again, and the 3rd United States Infantry came out of Arlington one more time with the caisson and the riderless horse and all that. And this time, since it was nearly a complete body, there were still, at that time, 3 Civil War widows living in 1997. 3 Civil War widows. These women did not live during the American Civil War. As young women in their 20s during the Depression, they married old veterans, because old Civil War veterans were the only people that seemed to have a complete income, guaranteed income, because they got a pension every month. And so long as they never married after their husbands died, they were still eligible to receive that pension. 3 of them were still receiving it in 1997. And 2 of them, one Union, one Confederate, were healthy enough to come back here to Gettysburg, and they followed the coffin in an open carriage. And before the grave was opened and the coffin was buried, they placed each a red rose on top of it. So whether he was Union or Confederate, he was buried by a widow. And this grave has already been declared. This will be where all future remains go. So you can always say you saw where the last soldier was buried at Gettysburg, and you will be right, because if we find one next week, he will go in that same grave. Okay? Unknown Civil War remains.
Soldier. How many? 19 unknown U.S. soldiers. Every time farmers would plow their fields in the spring, for decades, they would plow into a grave that had not been seen. It became commonplace. They just pick out all the big bones and they'd stick them in a box and they'd live in the barn. And the next time they came to town, they'd throw that box on the wagon with them and bring it in town. And they'd stop over here at the cemetery gatekeeper's house. And he'd wake up the next morning and be another box of bones sitting on his plate of property. And he would bury them properly, and he would issue a government headstone for them. So these two likely are Confederate soldiers. And there's more the whole way down there. There's one down there that's got 3 in it. The one with 19 we know are Union soldiers. If you've been out on the field yet, there's a place over near so-called Spangler Springs. They were doing road work over there about 1913. And they dug into a mass grave of Union soldiers that had been completely overlooked years before. And they knew from the buttons and the belt buckles they were United States soldiers. Since they didn't have any place in there to put them, they buried them in a mass grave basically right there, 19 of them. So we've got bodies from the battle here, and it is estimated today, a rough estimate, that there may be as many as 1,000 still out somewhere on the battlefield where they were originally buried. When you go through the battlefield, you're still going through the cemetery. It just doesn't have tombstones on it. Okay? Michigan. Maine. They're just pieces of bodies. 20th Maine, these are just dead. These were buried originally on Little Round. Because they knew where they were buried at, they were able to give these guys the identification. And then over here is the last piece of unknowns. But the idea was, well, maybe here's an old ring. It doesn't have any inscription, but maybe it's a family heirloom. Maybe someday the family would come back and they could go through those envelopes and maybe find that ring. And of course, nobody ever was identified with those. In 1933, when the Army gave the park over, the cemetery over to the park, they retained those envelopes. And they moved them to Baltimore. That's the last place they were seen in 1938 in a warehouse down there. And of course, World War II is breaking out in Europe, and very quickly Lend-Lease was put into effect by the Roosevelt administration. And we know for a fact that a lot of war munitions and things were queued up in Baltimore and New York and Boston, port cities, to send over to Europe. And to clear out some of those warehouses, we know that obsolete government records were destroyed. Part of the destruction process was placing them on barges, taking them off the coast and sinking. We think, I personally think it's true, that's where these 979 envelopes are today. I think they ended up at the bottom of the ocean for the Second World War. So, of course, we'll never know who they used to be. One of them was interesting because it had like $20 worth of gold coin. Surprised nobody said that's criminal. He had those coins. All right, let's step over here. We are standing at the town cemetery, which, when Lincoln spoke, there's no fences between it. Behind you was an open field. In front of you were 500 graves in various states. Some of those graves have been hit by artillery fire during the battle. We have, I think, 3 or 4 of them over the day that the families basically never repaired them. They're still damaged by artillery shells fired during the battle. That's the gatehouse of the Evergreen Cemetery, which was a prominent landmark during the battle. And can you guys see a statue of a woman? Actually, there's a bush in front. I can see her, the shining on her now. That is our Civil War Women's Memorial. And her name is Elizabeth Thorne. And Elizabeth Thorne lived in that house in July of 1863. Her husband, Peter, was the groundskeeper of the cemetery and the gravedigger. He was in the Army. She was in that house on the right-hand side of it, those 2 rooms, top and bottom, with her 3 children, her elderly father, her elderly mother. They all lived on one side of that gatehouse. And when the battle was over,
Elizabeth decided, you know, if Peter were here, he'd be out digging graves. That's my job now. And she went out and she dug 105 graves by hand. You guys have been around the battlefield, you've seen how rocky it is. She used a pick and a shovel. And then she and her father got bodies and buried them. And about 63, I believe, of her soldiers are still buried where she put them. If you drive down the Baltimore Pike down there towards the visitor center, just down over the hill, you'll see standard issue government headstones. Those are her graves. Now, what's interesting about this, I can't imagine me going out there in the heat of July doing it. She was 6 months pregnant. So get self-pregnant sometime, go out and dig graves all summer long and bury them. And it's also said that she had to deal with 35 horses. It didn't say how she dealt with them, but she had to deal with 35 dead horses in the confines of the cemetery. 3 months later, she delivered a baby girl, and she called her Rosa Meade Thorne. And I suspect that she had thought there might be a boy. This is the day before gender reveals. And she already had a name picked out for it. I think she was going to call him George Meade after the victor of the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, came out female. Can't call the female George. So she called her Rosa Meade. And Rosa only lived till she was 14 years old. She's buried in that cemetery today too. And Mrs. Thorne always believed that she was a sick child because of the exertions that she put in and the smell she smelled during that last trimester of pregnancy. The other statue I point out is that white one you see over there with the flag. That is also a battle casualty. That is Mary Virginia Wade, famous Ginny Wade around town, who was the only townsperson to die in the battle. She was 20 years old. In the morning of the 3rd of July, not more than 400 yards from where we're at, she was in the house with her mother baking bread when a stray bullet came up, went through the outside door, went through the kitchen door, and struck in the back of the kitchen. And she was buried right there. Now her sister, Georgia, whose house she was in, was also pregnant that summer, and she delivered a baby boy on the 1st of July, Lewis McClellan. And that is the reason Jenny Wade and her mother had come out to that house to help deliver that baby. Battle's going on. The battle ends up on this hill. They stayed in the house. And Georgia always believed that she was responsible for Jenny's death. If she had gone into town or had not had a baby at that time, it might have been a different situation altogether. She moved to Iowa after the war. That's where all the Wades and all the McClellans are today. They're in Iowa. She never forgot her sister. And in 1900, she made a plan to come back and have a marble statue placed over her sister's grave, carved by a woman sculptor named Anna Rogers. Day and age, late 19th century, we don't have women sculptors. She hired them. And there's a flag flying over the grave right now. Georgia was the chairwoman of the Iowa Women's Relief Corps, and its successor organization still exists today. And she managed to get the congressional delegation of Iowa to pass through Congress a resolution authorizing the flying of a flag over her sister's grave 24 hours a day unlit. It's one of 34 places in the country that you do not have to have an all-weather flag and you do not have to have a light on every night. And after this many years, the successor of that group still sends 2 brand new flags out to this cemetery every year and requests the old ones be returned to them. So I'm sure Georgia's been dead a century herself, but she still has power. So Jenny and Mrs. Thorne. Now, I promised to show you where Lincoln delivered to Gettysburg. Did I not?
So confused. I asked her when I was what year that picture was taken. He said the last year in Russia. I'm so confused. I mean, after, I guess since we moved to the US, I mean, yeah. So, but I don't know what that means. I don't want to ask. Maybe when I see the person, like, what does it mean? On the one who's had that shirt.
evening, everyone. Welcome to 100 Nights of Taps, Gettysburg 2023. On this beautiful evening, beautiful little muggy, June 24th, 2023. I don't know if you saw the beautiful rainbow over here a short while ago. Quite something. My name is John Tuscan. I'm the historian, archivist with the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania. The 100 Nights of Taps, Gettysburg is co-sponsored by the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania and the Gettysburg National Military Park in partnership with Taps for Veterans, the Gettysburg Licensed Battlefield Guides, and the Eisenhower National Historic Site. We are very honored this evening to welcome Staff Sergeant Andrew Bisnet from Stillwater, New York, tonight's bugler. Very appreciative individuals like Staff Sergeant Bisnet. This program could not exist without our dedicated buglers who come from all over the U.S. Different bugler every evening. They come on their own dime. So thank you, Andrew. This is how many years you've been playing with us? Well, his 5th year. This program's, we're in the 7th year. Andrew's been here 5 of the 7. Thank you, Andrew. I'd also like to introduce his sister Julie, who traveled down with us from New York tonight, doing some filming. Thank you, Julie. Also, a couple other introductions here. I want to introduce Wendy Ellen. She's the president of the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania and the founder of this program 7 years ago. Thank you, Wendy. Randy Huston, lifetime member of the Lincoln Fellowship and the official photographer. So if she gets in front of you, don't yell at her. She can't get in our picture. Finally, another member of our team, Scott Burkett, who's a board member of the Lincoln Fellowship, and he's here to help this evening. And finally, some very good friends of ours, friends of the fellowship, friends of the community, really part of the fabric of the Gettysburg community. Kim and Bob Fizzle. Kim and Bob will be doing our Enduring Pathway this evening, which is our educational component. So we'll be with them in a minute. But thank you guys for coming out. They've been every year. They've been, I think, from the beginning, the inception of the program, they've been participating. So we're very, very happy that you're here with us. Now this evening, we walked through this beautiful national cemetery, guided by pathways that brought us here to Soldiers National Monument. While walking along the pathways, we were surrounded by the graves of fallen heroes and their enduring stories of sacrifice, sorrow, as well as extraordinary bravery. Those same pathways converge here to the place where in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, one of the greatest speeches of all time. In our Enduring Pathway tonight, Kim and Bob are going to present the address and an interpretation of the Gettysburg Address.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Lincoln goes back in time to the Declaration of Independence, signed 87 years before he gave the speech. The founding document defines our national values, which Lincoln summarizes here as liberty and equality for all.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
Lincoln says that the United States is unique. No country has ever been founded on such high ideals. He says that the Civil War is a test of whether this nation, based on these standards, could survive.
We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
Lincoln uses this moment to help the country make sense of the severe loss of life. Why did so many have to die? It must be for the purpose of allowing so many others to gain their freedom. These brave soldiers died to protect American democracy and to provide permanent emancipation for the 4 million enslaved people throughout the nation. Lincoln is attempting to give proper tribute to those who perished and says that their actions speak louder than any words ever could.
It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here to dedicate great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
In the end, the Union won the Civil War and slavery was abolished. And so, as Lincoln said, the values of liberty and equality were given a new birth. However, he also correctly anticipated that it would be an ongoing struggle for the country to reach a point of true liberty and equality for everyone. It is up to all generations to make sure that the United States remains a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and to ensure that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln challenged us. He said that this unfinished work is a great task remaining for every generation.
Thank you, Jim and Bob. Once again, we're honored to welcome Staff Sergeant Andrew Ness, tonight's bugler. Andrew has a bachelor's, a master's degree of music education. He has been a musician and conductor with the 40th Army Band, Vermont National Guard for over 10 years. We meet here in Gettysburg National Cemetery, so we shall never forget our brave American veterans. We remain steadfast in our dedication to the great unfinished work which those who fought here, as well as in many foreign lands, so nobly advanced. And we honor that they gave the last full measure of devotion so that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Matt told you every evening. This year, we're honoring unknown soldier. We placed a representative image of an unknown soldier on a commemorative coin. Scott here showing you a blow up of that coin. Now this unknown soldier comes to represent all the soldiers buried here. Now here in Gettysburg National Cemetery, of the 3,354 bodies buried in the Soldiers National Cemetery, which is the Civil War section, 979 of them lie here without a name and without a known state of origin. These soldiers can be found in sections 1, right over here on my right, 14 behind it, and 22 over to the left, over this way. However, not all the unknown soldiers are buried in the unknown section. If the soldier was found on the field, and they couldn't identify him, but he had some uniform item or something else that would connect him to a state, that soldier would have been buried in the state section. If you look at the stone, you see Sergeant such and such, and then you may see a stone that says unknown. In some cases, they knew the rank. They knew it was a sergeant. They have sergeant unknown. Buried in that section. This year, we're honoring, we're moving this evening, we're honoring one unknown soldier. Tonight it's stone 20 in section 1, and we placed a small flag by his stone if you'd like to go and pay your respect this evening at the end of the program. Now with more than 40% of the Union Army's dead, perished without names at war's end, the work of locating the missing and naming tens of thousands of men designated as unknown would prove one of the war's most difficult tasks. I'd like the word according to you. Going to Kim. Taps every year at 7 p.m. Please join us again if you can. Also, please join us here on November 19th for the annual Dedication Day ceremony that's co-sponsored by the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania. This year we're commemorating the 60th centennial anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Our keynote speaker this year is Susan Eisenhower, granddaughter of General Eisenhower. Wow. Keynote speaker in the 1963 dedication ceremony. We'll also be joined by actor Graham Sibley, who was in the History Channel's three-part series, Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln scholars Doris Kearns Goodwin and Harold Halser will be joining us from We're also planning a tribute to officer civil rights pioneer Marion Anderson, who performed in 1963 General Eisenhower's request. For more information, please visit our website, Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania.org. Also, if you haven't already, we encourage you to visit the David Wills House out on the square, a place where President Lincoln put the finishing touches on the Gettysburg Address. Finally, this evening, before we close the program, we'd like to invite any active duty military, veterans, reservists, Guard, National Guard, please come forward and with Staff Sergeant Bisnet and myself.